Over the past number of years that I've been in ministry, I have made 25 trips to the Middle East, to Palestine, and have visited the places that the Gospels speak often about. One of the things that I have done in each of those is to collect some olive wood carvings, especially when we are in Bethlehem. And one of the special ones that I like are somehow or another what we would say the Holy Family. So either they are creations that are all together, Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus, or they are separate pieces. If you have nativity sets at home, you often have separate pieces for each of the figures in the traditional manger scene. So there was one that I particularly liked, but it was a little bit more modern in design, meaning that it wasn't so finely carved that you saw the facial features and the clothes had definition to them. But this was a very modern set of Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus. The one problem with the set was that the baby Jesus, as it laid in, like you might say, the crib, but it was just this kind of flat piece of olive wood. And the little figure of Jesus was not attached. So whenever I would move it, I had to always be careful because baby Jesus was so small that it was easy to get lost. Well, whatever possessed me this particular time, I decided to use the vacuum cleaner to dust because I figured that rather than trying to move a dust cloth and getting dust, that if the vacuum cleaner sucked up the dust, that was better. So I had the tube, and on the end was one of those brushes, and I'm going along, and all of a sudden there was no baby Jesus in the little thing. And for the life of me, I thought, poor baby Jesus got sucked up in the vacuum. And I was beside myself, really, because I had been so careful for about 10 years with poor little baby Jesus that I had decided that was it. No baby Jesus, because I was not going to open up the vacuum cleaner bag and try to root through the vacuum cleaner bag to find baby Jesus. So the little crib, sort of like the little manger here, remained empty for over a year. Now, please don't judge me for this, but the next time I went to vacuum the bedroom where this was, I went between the bed and the little bookcase, and lo and behold, there was baby Jesus. That instead of being sucked up into the vacuum, it had fallen between the bed and the bookcase. And so I was just ecstatic. I went, baby Jesus was lost and is now found. And then I glued him onto the little thing so that he wouldn't come off anymore. I have several pieces like that there are little pieces that can get lost. You know how that works sometimes? So that you have to do drastic things to stick baby Jesus into this, or otherwise he could potentially get lost again. I hinted at the beginning that this story and the one that we'll have next week are only found in the Gospel of Matthew, which suggests to us, if we do a little investigation into them, suggests that they are more for the audience of Matthew than for a general population. That something about this story today and the one next week is for an audience, as we know today, for a Jewish audience that has come to accept Jesus and therefore has, I wouldn't say made a transition to be Christian, but have somehow managed to find that they can bring together their Jewish tradition of the Torah with their new belief in Jesus. But that places them in a very precarious place. And the reason is because if you know history, that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. Scholars say that Matthew is written about 75 to 85 of the Common Era. So the gospel is being written after the temple has been destroyed. That was such a huge traumatic moment in the life of the Jewish community in Palestine, maybe not so much for the diaspora Jews who, were already focused in the synagogue, and so the sacrifice and ritual of the temple wasn't even on their radar anymore. But for the Jews living in Judea around Jerusalem, or even for that matter in Galilee, the loss of the temple and its ritual and the sacrifice was very traumatic for them. And the conservatives in the community said, well, it's perhaps because we did not follow the Torah to the letter, that we had become very lax. And you can read through, especially like the book of Maccabees, that many Jews were no longer carrying the old traditional Jewish names. They were now carrying Greek names like Alexander and Rufus, and names that were just anathema a generation before were now commonplace in the Jewish community. So the conservatives said it's because we have accommodated ourselves too much to the culture of Rome that we brought this on ourselves, the destruction of the temple. In a sense, it's a punishment from God. And so the conservatives said what we have to do is go back to the rigid adherence to the Torah, to the letter, to all of what it was about, in order to restore or survive as a Jewish community. We won't survive if we don't do that, because we're now being chased by the Romans through the countryside, who are trying to end our life, our personal life, and the life of our community. On the other hand, the more, I won't say progressives in the community, but the ones who found that this accommodation to the times, to the Roman culture, that it was not a threat at all, but rather an opportunity and a challenge to adapt or adopt if you will, or adapt, either way you want to look at it, to life as it was, reality life. The conservatives wanted, in a sense, to not just take things back, but to insulate and isolate their community even more they thought, in order to protect it. That survival depended upon them pulling, circling the wagons and pulling in on themselves, where the ones who had come to accept accommodation believed that it was keeping open to the culture, being present to the time, would enable them to survive, not in the same way, but they could still have the Torah, because what they had was this whole new community following Jesus. And many in that branch of Judaism believed that what Jesus said was really nothing outside of the Torah, but rather was a more authentic and genuine interpretation of the Torah than what the Sadducees and even the Pharisees had offered. And so to them, opening and accommodating to the world and being realistic about what that would mean, we survive not because we insulate, but rather we survive because we open ourselves. In other words, strict adherence to the tradition for the conservatives was the way to survive. Innovating in the faith meant that one survived in a very different way. So this particular text is more of a voice to the conservatives in the community. Notice at least 3 times a biblical text is quoted. This is to fulfill what had been said to the prophets. So that this event is less about historical reality, but more about the historicity of our tradition that suggests that when we make a connection back to not just the prophets, but I hope that you get the added layer to what this story is about, that it's connecting us all the way back, not only to the first Joseph, if you will, the son of Jacob, or the son of Israel, who fled. His brother sold him off, right? And he ends up in Jesus. He ends up in Egypt, interpreting dreams. Dreams, huh? Here you hear 3 times Joseph gets told in a dream. And we heard that back in Advent, right? Joseph gets told in a dream. So Joseph, the dream solver, if you ever went to see a Joseph in the amazing Technicolor dream coat, right? That's what that whole thing. You're a dreamer, Joseph. Yeah, okay, so what? But here it's connecting us back to that. So we're kind of remembering. And then it's connecting us to the significant event that happens after the time of Joseph in terms of the slavery and oppression of Israel in the land of Pharaoh. And then the great event of the Exodus, where they're liberated and set free. So they were brought into the land to survive. Now they're surviving by way of their exodus out of the land. And so that phrase, I brought my son out of Egypt, is meant to connect those in the community that are unsure about a future that invites their innovating and adapting to the world by saying, we can carry with us all of those traditions and we can bring those forward in a new way. No longer is it about those historical figures. Now it's about the way that this Jesus fulfills those points. In other words, it's no longer just dependent upon those historical figures. It's now dependent upon somebody who, at least some in the community, would have perhaps known Jesus personally, maybe by that point, maybe 40 years. It could be the elders in the community might have one day heard Jesus speak, might have been there in Galilee on the hillside when he took the bread and the fish and multiplied it for the thousands, if you accept that story as being history. That somehow or another, in that group of people who are struggling to accept surviving based upon adaptation and innovation, that this says, you can still hold on to what you believe. And you can still take it in a new way, a new perspective on it. And yet, in this story also, because by 75 and 85, not only are the followers of Jesus under pressure by the conservatives in the Jewish community, but they are also under pressure by the Romans. Here's another good historical date that we know as factual. This may not be factual. Playing his fiddle one day, Nero plays the fiddle as Rome burns, and he blames the Christians for the burning of Rome. It was probably an urban renewal attempt, to be honest, as historians say. The best way to revitalize your downtown is to burn it down and start over again. And that's what Nero did. And so now the followers of Jesus are doubly in this community of Matthew under the threat of persecution from the very empire that you are quite willing to accommodate to. And if you're under threat from the very empire that you hope will enable you to survive, then you're just not so sure. Think about it. As Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, people who lived in Jerusalem for generations, people who lived in the vicinity of Jerusalem, Bethany and several other communities, Bethlehem maybe, had to flee Jerusalem because of the Romans. Some didn't make it very far because the Romans were able to track them down and kill them. Some made it as far as Galilee or shores further away, Egypt, Rome, Greece. So they carried with them the memories of that terrible, terrible night when the Romans breached the walls of Jerusalem and set fire to the soul of their faith community, the temple. I say those things because now if you listen again to this story, what you get is the writer telling those people in the community who have been traumatized by the destruction of Jerusalem, but who've ended up in the community in Galilee. There it is again, right there in black and white. Herod seeks to destroy us, seemingly killing off the very life force of the community. Have you ever wondered why in Judaism, even today, why children are so important in the community? And why in the Holocaust, children were among the most prevalent ones to die in the gas chambers? We know this, right? Because children are the future. And if you don't have a future generation, you don't have a future. And so Rome attacks the future of the community. Now you want to know, question, should you trust Herod? Should you trust the Roman emperor who is not interested in your survival or your future? Whether the story is true doesn't make any difference. The fact is that it tells us, told those members of the community, this is what happens. This is what can happen. That the very life, blood, soul, future could be snuffed out in an instant. Therefore, don't trust the empire. Don't put all your eggs in the basket of Caesar in Rome. The story does say this then, because notice how at the end when Herod, it might suggest this, just thinking about it, that the generation of Herod dies off, although Archelaus is still ruling. But Joseph and Mary and the baby travel not back to that place of Bethlehem, but go further afield to Galilee. Well, after all, because we know Jesus is from Nazareth, not from Bethlehem after all, right? But also Galilee is a place always, even for the ancients, was always a place of rebel rousers and prophets and people who were disruptive and people who thumbed their noses at the Jerusalem establishment and were willing to stake their lives on their freedom and dignity and integrity. Well, it just makes sense that Jesus would end up in that place, because that's who they had come to know Jesus to be, as a rebel rouser, a nonconformist, although he did follow the tradition, but in his own way, right? There it is. The story teaches Matthew's community about their life. But what might it teach us? Question. What might it say to us? Anybody have any thoughts or ideas? What might this story say for us today? Does any part of the story sound familiar for us today?
The idea of not conforming to your society, but being able to grow and adapt to the society.
So that somehow or another, it's not to conform to the society, but somehow to work to transform the society. Okay? Anything else?
There's also an element of respect for the conservative.
Okay. Not to totally dismiss the ones who want to hold on to the tradition. And that's definitely how the rest of the gospel unfolds, is that there's a great deal of respect for the tradition, but with that twist and innovation added on to it from the perspective of Jesus in that sense. Anything else, though, closer to home that might sound in this story today?
Well, I don't think we are the conformist community. We are the rabble rousers.
Are we enough of a rabble rouser?
We are in our ideals, and that clearly is something in my mind. Where should we be?
Okay, all right.
Of an expansive mindset and not limiting one.
So rather than a limited mindset, a more expansive and open. What's involved when we go from that circle the wagons kind of mentality to being a more expansive and open? What's involved really in that? So it does take some action and commitment, right? Yeah, what else?
Greater choice.
Greater choice, that there's more choices and options for us. What else?
Risk of being targeted.
That it can be a risk targeted from those who we make uncomfortable because of that view of reality. What else? That it does take some sacrifice on our part, right? What else?
Communication with those who are not with us.
Okay, that sometimes we don't do that too well, do we? We tend to dismiss those who disagree with us, or who are not like us, or who are that. We tend to dismiss them and in that process demean them in some way. But what else? I think
Along that line, finding allies outside of our community.
so in a sense, that's what Matthew is trying to do with the story in a way, that we can find, that we need to be able to find allies outside the community who share a similar vision, if you will, right? And in sharing a similar vision, then we broaden even the strength of what we as an individual community or individuals can do. What else? And thinking about when you circle the wagons, you tend to exclude. When you open, you tend to be inclusive. This is pushing it a little bit, and this is what actually I was thinking before today, the direction, because there's some thought, and here's another question, some thought, that if we look at the movement of Mary and Joseph and the baby fleeing from the violent threat of Herod to a place of safety, the question in the return is, will we have safety and security when we return? Does that story, part of the story, sound familiar? Thinking inclusively.
Well, they're refugees.
Yeah, how about all the refugees and asylum seekers over the holiday, right? Wasn't that part of the national debate and conversation? Whether we were going to bring an end to, what was it, Title 42? And then seeing the pictures, if you watched them, especially the fathers and mothers carrying their babies across the Rio Grande. I mean, just, wow. What would they hear in this story? It's interesting. I think I might have mentioned this before. Several years ago, I was asked when we had the pocket shelters. I think I did tell that story. And there I was downtown Phoenix at one of these before they had CAS and the big shelter. There was some gymnasium somewhere. I don't even remember where it was. And I was asked to come down and do a Christmas midnight service for the workers in the shelter, at which, like we try to do for the I Help people, get them to join us for worship. And there I am in this small room with some of the people who were finding shelter in the gym part. It was just like, what do I say? They're living this story. I have no presumption to think that I know how they hear the story. When I hear it one way, from a privileged position of safety and security. When they hear it perhaps differently, from their position of fear and anxiety. And if you've ever seen those shelters or been here over, close to when they get ready to bed down here in this room, I mean, what one of us would tolerate laying on one of those thin mats on the ground? And yet, that's something that some of those refugees and asylum seekers at the border don't even have. I just pose those kinds of questions and throw them out because you see the story, if it's narrow, then we end up asking history questions and needing it to be fact. And the long Christian tradition seems to go in that direction, where if we read the story with a more inclusive vision, understanding both the political, economic, and social realities of First Matthew's community, and then trying to bring it into our lives and our community, but also with that larger view that the story ends up being very different and sounding very different and looking very different. And the application of it might be very different too. It's easy to dismiss the historical story. Not so easy when we're called to act on the story in the present moment, when we include refugees and asylum seekers, and whether we're accommodating to the violence of the empire, when we accommodate too far. A lot of questions I leave you on the first day of the new year.